Pharmaceutical Processing, in conjunction with INTERPHEX 2017, presents INTERPHEX Live.
Okay, welcome to our next session. We're going to be talking about cGMP clean space and innovative solutions for compliant and cost-effective facilities. We got Ed Caulkins with us, and Blake Hodess, Charlie Johnsrud. Right. About that, got it right the first time. And Tim, yep. Right? All right. So, pretty much, let's just make sure we got to drop this mic. I can see it coming. Anyway, so let me ask the first question. What are clean rooms, and are they just for sterile work? Let's just ask that first question. Anybody want to take the first run here? Just jump right up. Don't be shy.
What was the first question?
My first question is, what are clean rooms, and are they for every process I have? I mean, I always think sterile. Is that it or not?
Well, that's an interesting thing is I used to have, when you talk to somebody that doesn't know a clean room, you'll describe to them a clean room and they'll say, well, what do you mean, like a hospital operating room? And my line will always be, no. If I get operated on, I want to get operated on at IBM because it's cleaner, whether it's so forth. So from a clean room standpoint, the things we know as clean rooms in the everyday world is just such the low end of the clean room per se from that standpoint. And I'll say all the time, it's one of the largest industries that nobody knows about, because unless you're in it, unless you're a user of a clean room, or you're a designer or a constructor or supplier of a clean room, you don't understand how large an industry it is and how many millions and millions of square feet there are of operating clean rooms in just the United States.
So let me ask you this, do all process rooms need to be clean rooms then? Well, we've established they don't have to be operating rooms. So
not all process rooms need to be clean rooms. There are specific processes that are regulated, that have government regulations, cGMP requirements, sterile fill, other things that require clean space. There are other processes that don't need clean rooms. What we see is that there's a certain decision matrix that you have to go through in the company, in the business, to make sure that you evaluate whether it's a regulated product and you need it, whether your product needs it for, defect reduction, or sterile processing, and things that may not even be regulated. But in reality, there's many processes that lead into clean rooms that don't require to be clean. So you might have a product in the end that's required to clean, but it may only need to be cleaned and sterilized and packaged clean, not necessarily manufactured clean. Whereas other processes absolutely have to be clean and regulated, and you can't, if you don't do it in a clean room, you're never going to be able to sell the product.
I think that's an important point. I want to stress the point that it's the process that has to be clean, and that's what drives the requirement for the space. So that understanding, going through the requirements that Blake mentioned, and understanding what the process is that needs to be housed drives the requirement for the technology and the type of clean room that gets created. Because we've seen various companies work on, smaller startup companies work in a certain kind of environment, but as it scales up and as you add employees to an operation, you need to rely more on the facility to maintain that cleanliness than you do on SOPs.
One of the interesting things about the pharmaceutical or the biotech industry is regulation drives the cleanliness class. In all the other industries, regulation doesn't necessarily drive it. The product yield or the requirements, and it's somewhat nebulous as to what requirements, what cleanliness levels you need, and so forth. One of the things about the pharma industry is that regulation drives the cleanliness requirements. And interestingly enough is what I find, and Ed, you might be able to tell us a little bit, when you get somebody in a new pharmaceutical product, something new, and they don't quite know how to classify it, or what cleanliness level that it will need or it will be regulated under, it's very difficult for them to figure out what they need from a clean room standpoint.
No, you're correct. It's a process of working with them sometimes to, even down to just an analysis of the regulations to determine what it is that they need. There's a positive and a negative. We always want the clean room to be good enough But we also know that the clean room is one of the most expensive construction projects you can undertake. The last thing we want to do is build a clean room that's just way out of scale with what the product requirements are, because then the owner's just inherited this massive cost that is tough to justify at the end of the day, because he's got to make a product at a profit.
Yeah, they're not inexpensive to build, and they're not inexpensive to run. So if you build, one of the things that's happening a lot now is that the products we build clean rooms out of are much better than they were 20 years ago, 25 years ago when the standards were developed. Filtration is better. We're using aluminum products where they used to use, steel products. We're using prefabricated walls and modular walls and clean rooms where drywall used to be. So we're reducing the potential for particulate, which has allowed us to reduce the amount of air going through a clean room, which allows us to reduce your energy costs. But again, if you over-specify at the beginning, you'll pay more, and you'll have to run it more, and so there's a lot of innovations happening with regulating the clean rooms with particle counters, with driving energy costs down with doing I call it energy consumption regulation that we didn't used to do before, because the regulations used to tell us we had to be at a certain point no matter what. But the new regulations and new ISO standards let us do more engineering, figure out more of, for your particular product, along with the regulations, where can we be to give you a more effective clean room.
Okay, there was two questions came up. So what new products specifically are available to construct the clean rooms as opposed to what was available 10 years ago?
Well, on the pharmaceutical end, and we still see a lot of it, drywall with epoxy paint was very popular for walls. It still is, because we want seamless walls. We want walls that can be don't have any cracks or crevices, and don't get any growth on them, any viable growth. But there's new modular walls that are seamless, like the aluminum honeycomb panels with UPVC or PET finishes. There's, these are just starting to they were big in other industries and just started to migrate over probably in the last 7 to 10 years to the pharmaceutical industry. Same thing with wall systems. There's other seamless types of systems. The seamless flooring is now being used on walls and ceilings. And this gives you a much better product, as well as filtration has come a huge long way. They've started building filters with better media, with better potting materials to hold the filters in. They're making room-side replaceable filters in many different types now, so you don't have to over-specify. You can go as rugged as a PharmaSeal if you're doing viral work or something, and you can go as easy as a room-side basic can for.
All right.
But these weren't out there 10 years ago.
Okay, and so let me ask you this. Just one of the things I picked up on is, it's always a debate about air changes and air rates for clean rooms. So Ed, are these things sacred? They carved in stone or what?
Well, they're not. Years ago, there was the federal standard that basically set the clean room velocity requirement. At that point in time, the air change rates were extremely high, probably in the order of 600 air changes per hour. At this point in time, depending on the process that's being done in that room, we don't need to circulate that much air. Again, it varies depending on the needs of the product. And as Tim had mentioned, depending on the regulations, you may be forced to do more than it really needs. But we always want to pay attention to the fact that every room doesn't need to be a massive 600 air change per hour clean room. Many products can be manufactured at a much lower air change rate. It's still a significant amount of air and it's still a significant amount of energy. But if you control what's happening in the room, those air change rates can be reduced and still maintain a perfectly good clean room.
One of the issues that you've got, of course, is that when you're trying to apply engineering to an industry that's based on fear, and the reality of it is the pharma and the biotech industry are based on fear. So, that's what's motivating and that's what's driving things. And we're trying as an industry to bring practical engineering in. And then the reality that everybody always forgets about is we've got better surfaces in clean rooms, we've got better products in clean rooms, they're not generating particulate. So the only thing that we've got generating particulate is either the product, which you cannot design a facility to keep to clean up what's already in that facility. But the real problem is people, of course. It always is with every clean room. And so the reality of it is that you've got to apply a lot of factors related to the layouts of the room, the sizes of the room, the number of people in the room, and so forth, in order to actually come up with the right air changes. Because even in regulatory required environments, they give you some leeway.
Well, yeah, so the ISO standards, this is one of the nice innovations that's coming up, is, the ISO standards are being looked at all the time. And currently there's recommended practices. They give you recommended air changes, or they say use your engineer's background and expertise. And what's coming in the newest regulations is getting away from even specifying air changes per hour and saying do dilution calculations. So look at the customer's product, look at the gowning, look at the wipe down procedures, figure out where the particulate's coming from, and then calculate your air changes, rather than just saying, like Ed said, Fed Spec 209E, we still see it in specifications today. Well, if you're going to meet that, it's 90 feet plus or minus 20 all the time. You don't have a choice, But if you get to the ISO standards, you can use your experience, you can help the customer not spend a ton of money and still get what he wants. And when we get into the European standards, they give us the same kind of leeways because they're based on the ISO standards. And grade A, B, C, D, whatever we're doing, if you can look at that and you can calculate it, you now can use good engineering practices instead of just going to the cookbook and saying, clean rooms were, you asked about what's a clean room. Clean rooms were designed by the Air Force to build transistors. That's where clean rooms came from, period. That's where they started, 1964. That's where it all came from. And everything was based on that up until, probably 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when the ISO standards started taking over from the Federal Spec 209E, and that made us all be able to use our brains instead of having to just, beat the heck out of something with a lot of air.
I have one question. Let me ask you this. One of the things we found with design and faster time to market is, I don't think I have to tell you guys, invariably, the cart never goes before the horse here, So, Charlie, let me just ask you, I'm a development guy, all right? Is there something I should be doing that helps this process? If so, what do you need? You're following me?
Well, I think we've touched on it already, is understanding what the process is key to starting the whole design process, and understanding kind of what the product is, what the operations are. We've touched on clean rooms, but I don't think we've mentioned the smallest of the spaces at the end of this. A lot of times is an isolator or a biosafety cabinet that doesn't even have people in it. But I think going through the process and understanding the process with a team that understands the implications of each of the requirements that an owner or an operator may have allows you to start to balance those priorities so that decisions are made as you move into design and into the preparing to build.
But to circle with Charlie said, and circling back to Blake, one of the things that Federal Standard 209 did was it took experience out of the engineering process. By that is, it was overly conservative, and it allowed anybody who followed the rules to be able to design a clean room that functioned properly. What the ISO standard does is it leaves it up to the professionals to understand these things. And as a consultant who works for owners, one of the things I'll always say to the owners is hire experience. Because we can all say sitting here and we've all got an enormous amount of experience. It's the sum of all of our mistakes. There isn't something that's gone wrong with a clean room that I haven't done in my career, because it just happens to all of us. That's how we learn. And the reality of it is that what I'm finding an enormous amount is that engineering firms that don't really know about clean rooms are looking up at the standard and applying the standard, but when they applied Federal Standard 209, it was so conservative that it worked. Well, when you apply ISO, if you're not using experience to pick the right air change rate for the given class, that can lead to an enormous problem with performance of that clean room.
Let me ask you, while we're on that, one of the things that so I need this clean room. So, there's got to be, what are the hidden costs? What are the unforeseen costs in this particular case there? You got to, you said in your experience, there's got to be, you know, the unforeseen costs that need to be considered when you're developing a cGMP situation?
Time.
That's the one that's always
Time is
over.
the hidden cost. We can all say that is, and one of the things that modular components allow you to do is shorten the time to market, shorten the time period by which you've got to get to market. I have built many a pharmaceutical clean room in my life that never got utilized because a company had to make a decision to get a facility to market by a given time because a product was in regulatory approval, and then that product never received regulatory approval. And the clean room that they've now developed is a white elephant. So the reality of it is anything that you can do that will shorten the process to take the decision process by the owner and push it out as far as possible is going to be an enormous benefit to them.
Yeah.
One other thing that's really a big hidden cost is the customer has a preconceived notion. You know, the end user has a preconceived notion of what they think the clean room should be. And we walk into this all the time. We walk in and there's a sketch and it says, this is our clean room, we need to get it built in 4 months. And this is the class. But nobody's questioned why it looks like that, how it's built like that. So, you know, if we don't question that, a lot of times we run into jobs that we have to fix where somebody just went down the road with that idea and said, okay, that's great. And the customer got to the end and the clean room didn't work. I mean, it might have certified when it was empty, but when they put their equipment in and they put their people in there, it doesn't work. And I mean, that's a huge disaster, right? So you got to question up front. You really, like Tim said about professionals, these guys here, designers, I mean, there are a lot of, with all the types of walls, floors, ceilings, air handling systems, everything that's out there today, you can pick the right product to get your product to market in time. You just got to do it.
All right, let me throw this one open to you. I mean, obviously there is modular versus traditional. So like, where's the cost lay in there? Why don't we start, Charlie, why don't you take a run at that one?
Well, there are cost differences, obviously, between all.
Or there are advantages too. I mean, throw that, yeah.
And that, again, it goes back to the discussion of the process that we can have during the design phase, where you, as Tim's point is that you work with a team who understands those trade-offs and the advantages of whether it's a wall or ceiling system, whether it's an HVAC system, and how they go together. Being able to work through the matrix that Blake mentioned early on and make those decisions, because they are trade-offs. There are trade-offs in terms of what a company can afford and what type of investment they want to make, as opposed to how it will function. But it has to meet the requirements of the process, as we said before. And we could get you to, a team can get you to the point where you'll meet those requirements for the cost that you're willing to invest.
One of the hidden costs, or one of the hidden reductions of cost, is tax consequence. Okay, and one of the interesting things when you talk about modular versus traditional construction, you know, a modular construction can be considered capital equipment, and you can get an accelerated depreciation from it, whereas traditional construction, although in a clean room, it should be considered equipment because the clean room's just there to be the environment around the process. Oftentimes, regulating bodies or governing bodies will not consider it as such if it's not truly movable in the sense that modular is.
So in this particular case, my air handling equipment that I use to maintain is not considered part of the process. Did I hear that right?
Well, it can be. It depends where you are. You know, different states have different regulations. You know, my company's headquartered in Massachusetts. They won't give you the air handlers, but they'll give you the walls, they'll give you the ceilings, they'll give you the filtration, they'll give you the controls. But the air handlers, they say, you know, if you put in a 20,000 square foot clean room, you would have had 20,000 square feet of something there getting air conditioned. So they won't give you that as part of the clean room and part of your tax exemption. You know, they won't give you the floor, they won't give you the sprinkler system. And we go into different states and they all have different regulations about
I
that.
got you. But do clean rooms in general, they require a large air handling? I mean, what do we do? While we're on, I mean, we're talking about capital expense here. So a clean room by definition has to have a large air handling?
They do. I mean, typically the air change rate is so much higher than a standard occupied space, you know, let's call it office space, that the equipment is much larger. And it actually leads us, as part of the design process, to determine ways to minimize the size of those units. So, for instance, we have some clean rooms where we may have a makeup air handling unit to condition outside air, dehumidify, filter, condition it to a cooling temperature we need, and we may introduce that into a supply plenum, and the bulk of the air is actually circulated by fan filter modules, which is just a HEPA filter with a fan as part of the sealing system, and it just circulates the larger volume of air in the clean room, and the makeup air unit does the ultimate outside air temperature control, if you will, to the space. We actually come across this a lot because it's a significant savings, not only in equipment costs, but in structure and location to put all this equipment. Because these units can be extremely large, and every increment of size relates to dollars.
Well, the operating costs as well, they add on to that as well, long-term use of the facility.
But if you take a look, you know, if you're doing office space, you're doing general space, you're doing warehouse space, you're talking 1 to maybe 3 air changes per hour.
Correct.
You know, we don't even start, you know, the clean rooms, we start at the bottom at ISO 8, in a very low-end clean room, we start at 5 air changes per hour. So we're almost double anything you do. So immediately we start, you know, your costs start to escalate because it's, you know, you're not doing what you're doing in an office space or a warehouse space. And because you have to have, you typically have to have HEPA filtration, we start to see a pressure increase, which then drives the equipment up even higher because you're not just blowing through a diffuser. So literally, you know, like Ed said, it may not be huge equipment, but it's twice as much as anything else the minute you start into a clean room than regular space.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
You know, one of the things, believe it or not, in my career, before I got into the pharmaceutical industry, I was actually an intern for a while. I worked for Varian SFD. I don't know if you guys remember them. They used to make magnetrons during Vietnam. Anyway, they had a clean room that used to blow me away. I mean, it was over here in Union, New Jersey. One of the things that I always thought was tough was the visibility and seeing into visibility, looking into a clean room, the doors and all. I mean, at the time, compared to where we're at now, I mean, that was archaic. Charlie, we'll take it this way. Blake, why don't you start? Charlie, you chime in, because I see you nodding your head there. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. I mean, 15, 20 years ago, I've been building clean rooms since 1981. You know, I mean, we never put a window in except for the door so somebody didn't bump into each other. Now, it's all about viewing. Productivity is better. The managers can stand outside the clean rooms. Most of the modular systems all have, you know, all have clean room wall systems you can look inside with. I mean, granted, we have customers who don't want anybody to see their process, and we don't put any windows in. But, you know, we also have customers that want their customers to see the product. They want to market it. I mean, we've done things like putting, you know, all glass walls on conference rooms so the customer can look at the product being made, and when they're doing their source inspection, they don't have to go through the gown room, go in the clean room, and disturb all the production for every other customer. 15 years ago, nobody would have done that. You know, by the way, Varian still doesn't let anybody look in their clean rooms on building one now, so you know that's not unusual.
No, those are the points. The viewing, the safety of the operators, the productivity, but creating an environment that people who are spending their day in there also has a benefit. If you can position, you can arrange the space and position it so that they actually get some daylight. They actually know that it's daytime or nighttime outside. It's another requirement that we apply to the design of these types of facilities, because after all, it is people who are working in there, even though they're the source of contamination.
Ergonomics and worker comfort has become a much bigger topic in the clean room than it used to be, between the flooring types and even as far as, I mean, we have customers that put, TV screens basically on the walls, and, you know, and bring in news and other things for the people working in those rooms that have to stand at one machine all day long. You know, they don't hear anything, they don't see anything. It can be brutal.
The funniest thing about the pharmaceutical industry is, and one of the issues with the pharmaceutical industry, of course, is the walls and the ceilings and the cleaners that they have to hold up to. There's all different cleaners, and there's no surface that holds up to all the different cleaners. Ironically enough, except one, which is glass. And one of the interesting things is that from a standpoint of a surface in a pharmaceutical environment that from a cleaning standpoint would hold up, glass holds up better than anything else. So the idea that you have truly a glass clean room from one side is very interesting and intriguing, from the ability to look into the cracks and crevices and make sure there is not contamination, and then for the ability to hold up to the cleaners. I mean, I don't know that we'll ever get there, but it's interesting.
So let me just ask, I mean, I've been in facilities where the whole thing was glass. I mean, got to the point where you lose track. I'm totally disoriented. But having said that, okay, we got that. Glass is the best surface, but I mean, you got to put glass together. Doesn't that present a problem? I mean, isn't the joints a problem? I mean, who wants to? Ed, Charlie, whoever.
Architect should take that one.
Yeah, there you go. Well, he wants you to take the fall. Go ahead. No, out of curiosity, I mean.
Absolutely.
No, there are materials that can be used to connect glass and to seal glass together. I think that one of the issues with the glass is kind of positioning it in the room. But I think there was a situation where I think, Ed, you did a project that had a return air wall as glass.
Correct.
Both sides. So that had to be sealed as the air was brought through it into the room.
Right, and the project that Charlie refers to, actually Blake is familiar with as well. And it covers a lot of the items we talked about. The customer, other than a clean room for their product, which was the key item, the next thing they wanted was a clean room that they could see from outside. They could bring their customers in, and their customers could view the production of their materials without, as Blake had mentioned, without having to get gowned up and walk into the room, because as we know, usually the biggest source of contaminant is the people in the clean room, and nothing's worse than having people in that clean room that weren't trained to be in that specific clean room, because they're just trying to see what they want to see, but they may not necessarily have all the protocol down for how they should be operating in that room. So this particular clean room literally was 2 plate glass walls from floor to ceiling. It did take an evaluation of materials to be used, or till we have resolved what would be used to seal those plates of glass as they got butted up together, as well as the track at the floor where they were also sealed to isolate the space from outside. But at the end of the day, there was a way to do it. It was a 12-inch cavity wall, which they could physically clean from inside. And it gave, at the end of the day, the customer had a space that they could stand outside in street clothes, and it felt like they were in the clean room. They took it to the point where even the light fixtures in the hallway and the ceiling were done to match the clean room, so that they felt they were in the clean room, even though they technically were not.
Well, I tell you, that brings up a couple of points. Something that I always forget. So Ed, I mean, we talked a lot about the walls. So obviously, the way you put stuff in this clean room has got to be key. So either you or Blake, I mean, talk to me about, when you put stuff in, the laminar, the whole thing. I mean, that's not a trivial decision.
No, I mean, as processes go, typically, a customer has a process and lays out a process, and as the engineers and the builders, we need to look at, how the equipment lays out, how it affects the returns. How are we, one of the things that also is, become prevalent in the industry that is with the advent of, computers getting better, is being able to do computational flow dynamics and computerized flow models, and being able to actually model things with people's equipment in the room, so we can see how the airflow is going to go over the tools. If you need to move a tool from point A to point B, when we're done. But we run into this all the time. I mean, like I said earlier, rooms will certify empty. Rooms will certify with people, with the tools in them. But then the people get in there and work on the tools, and now we have a problem. So you have to look at all those different conditions, and it can be very important. It can be, we see assembly rooms where people are assembling, and all they need to do is buy perforated tables, and we'd have great airflow. But they buy solid tables, and the next thing you know, we have problems. So there's just that kind of stuff should be thought all the way through, and it's something that generally when you get good engineers and architects looking at these things, they see that up front, and you know, in some clean rooms, you know, back to the air changes and stuff like that. I mean, some equipment is huge, and some equipment is really big and doesn't really lend itself to a clean room, but it also takes up the cube space. So now we take a look at that, and you know, back to the fact that you're allowed to calculate. Ed can go in and say, oh, wait a minute, I got a room that 50% of the cube is missing. I can reduce my air changes. I can save the customer energy, and I still can get my cleanliness levels and make it work. And you couldn't do that before.
But so many designers think that designing of the clean room ends with the filter layout in the ceiling, and they don't think about the airflow once it gets in there, and making sure that once it's in the room, it moves in the right direction. It moves across the product first, and then across the people, and then out, because the people are generating it. And I have seen so many clean rooms that don't perform, not because they don't have enough air changes, or not because they don't have enough filters, but because they don't have the proper amount of return air grills in the proper locations.
Right.
Well, let me ask you, I had one question, okay, and this is something, so laminar flow, unidirectional airflow, are they the same or not? I mean, for example, perforated tables, unperforated tables, it's not a setup, it's a question I had. Who wants to answer that?
Thanks. Well, yeah, they are not the same. I mean, technically laminar flow would be a unidirectional flow from ceiling to floor or to the work surface. Essentially, anything above an ISO 5 or Class 100 clean room, it's very difficult to achieve that, especially when you add people, equipment, obstacles in that room. So we, except for very extreme cases, we typically don't refer to it as laminar flow. It's really unidirectional flow in the room.
Laminar's not a relative term. Unidirectional is a relative term.
Thank you,
There you
I
go.
appreciate it. So having said that, who writes the URS for this? It sounds to me like the mistake starts there.
Many
Okay?
times, many times. I think we can all attest to that. We often do get the chance to participate in that exercise, although not always. And there are items in that URS that not only do they need to be identified correctly, but they also need to be identified to give the owner some wiggle room, if you will. I mean, for instance, I've seen many URSs where they say the differential pressure across the wall has to be 0.05 inches from inside to outside the room. But if you take that literally, then if the room tests out and it's 0.045, technically it doesn't meet the URS. And I've seen many owners struggle over that because they had the right target in mind, but they didn't give themselves a range to work with, and they got caught by their own paperwork.
The critical difference is the design criteria and the acceptance criteria. A good URS has a design criteria and then an acceptance criteria. I will tell you that 8 out of 10 of them, they don't even specify that you've seen it come across.
No, I think that goes back to the point that we've all made occasion here, is that getting the design team, the people responsible for designing and building the facility involved early on, particularly when the URS is rolled out, because a lot of those requirements don't go to the specifics of the space or the room or the systems or the acceptance at the end. And that team can translate that information into the built form, starting from a URS. And challenging the URS at the very beginning is where you start to pick up the time and you start to kind of economize on the whole process.
Where we can save our clients the most money is developing the URS. So they understand when they're making decisions that may seem insignificant to them, but may impact design and cost significantly, and they're making decisions not understanding the impact of those decisions.
I think in a lot of cases, clients forget that there's an engineering capability and there's a functionality capability. How many times have we seen people put a process in bed and the process is built around the engineering capability of a piece of equipment? I'd be darned if I found that I can run a process plus or minus 1 degree, although the engineering for the equipment certainly can. Is that the kind of thinking we're talking about here?
Yeah, we get URSs all the time, and the first thing out of the box is we want to run the room at 68 plus or minus 2 degrees, which is comfortable for somebody in a gown. but their product doesn't get affected between 20 degrees and 80 degrees, okay? They just put themselves out of business the minute they're out of spec, you know, because all of a sudden you can't produce the product, whereas you could if you want to design it to that, that's fine. But if you want to, you know, if you want your URS, your product's not bad between 20 and 80. Same thing with humidity. So we say go as broad as you can and then tighten it up during your design period, but you'll have this acceptance criteria where you're not throwing away product, you're not having to stop operations and things like that. And it's what you said, you know, they pick it based on some past experience or something to do with the process equipment that isn't really what happens in the room, in the product. And so, you know, we see it a lot, and like Tim said, we can save a lot of money there because, you know, you go from your URS, you create a BOD, you get the engineering done, you get it into a much tighter scenario, but you have leeway. So if your makeup air unit shuts down because the power goes out, it takes 20 seconds for the generator to come back up, you didn't lose the whole plant, you know, you covered yourself, you know, versus it's always going to be this pressure 100% of the time, etc. You know, I can't go down or up. So that's where we see a lot of, especially nowadays, because it's such heavily regulated space, you know, people make these mistakes and say, well, my last clean room did this. Yeah, but your last room really had a broad band, you just didn't know it, so now you know, you killed that band.
Okay, guys, I mean, you get called in by a client and you wind up talking to engineering. In my opinion, that should be a red flag right there. Cross-functional or non-cross-functional. You gotta have a lot of other input for you guys to do exactly what you need to do. What has been your experience? We'll take it from Tim, and then we'll work down the line.
Well, interestingly enough, is the whole idea of cross-functional and not cross-functional. Of course, your user team, your owner team has to be cross-functional, but so does your design team. One of the interesting things is that you can't design the systems in a silo, and you can't specify the systems in a silo. You have to have cross-functional, because as much as you wouldn't think so, architectural things affect mechanical things, affect electrical things, and they're all interrelated. So I'm a believer that you need to have cross-functional teams. Interestingly enough, I'm a believer in the design-build process, but the most successful projects I've worked on have been design-build, so that the contractors and the designers and the owner are all in the room together making the decision, because that allows them to make the most complete decision with all of the impacts represented at the table.
I mean, clearly, bands of tolerance. You got to have somebody who knows the product, and that's the guy who designed the product. I mean, you know, in other words, the classic is your temperature variation. I mean, stability data would tell you where your functionality is.
So you asked about cross-functional teams.
Yeah.
Like Tim said, you got to have cross-functional teams, but that really means everybody. So, you know, we get the production guy, we get the, this is what happens all the time. We get the production guy, we get the engineering guy, we don't get the QC guy. He's the guy who really knows what he wants to test it to, right? He comes in at the end and goes, hey, that's not my SOP, I need it to be this. And we're sitting there going, we designed it, we built it, we certified it, and it doesn't work because you weren't involved from the beginning. So, you know, if you're out there and you're doing your project and you know, you need to get somebody representing, you know, and sometimes it's the sales guy. I mean, you know, we do projects and we sit there and we say this, you know, we got this, and this, and a sales guy comes to me and goes, oh no, we're gonna be 50% more than that in the fourth quarter already, just on orders. That's not gonna be enough. So you gotta get, you really gotta get the customer focused on meeting with you with the right people, because you guys, some of you are smiling, you can see we've been down this road where you know, everybody trips because nobody got all the information, right? And so, you know, we're trying to design it, then we're trying to build it, trying to permit it, and we're trying to certify it and meet all these programs. And, you know, we finished one recently where everybody agreed, including quality, to the way the thing was built. And we got to the end, they had an SOP that nobody really knew about, so the pressure gradients were, instead of 0.025, had to be 0.03. Then they went and bought a system to do QC that really requires 0.04. So we had to go, you know, that the owner bought, their independent, you know, their independent environmental monitoring system. So we're sitting there going, I hope we got enough makeup air, you know, because we're changing the entire grade of the plant, because people did something that nobody knew about.
Right.
But the QC guy never wants to be at the table when it's being designed, because then they can't complain about it when it's
Exactly.
done.
So Charlie, functional, not cross-functional?
No, I agree that the team coming all together, because every person that's participating with that project, from kind of the facilities guy to the QC to the architect and the builder and the engineers, all have priorities and all understand what are critical for that project. And it's when that whole team sits down together and discusses what the priorities are and come to an agreement on what is most appropriate for the total facility is when it's going to be a success.
Absolutely. Ed?
Along those same lines, going beyond the design component, I think what we're seeing a lot more of, and Blake probably has seen it forever in what he does, but most of the clean rooms we do now are design build to some extent or another, and that becomes extremely important from a cost and time control, management control. The sooner we have the guys that are going to build the room on board, the sooner we get. It's one thing for Charlie and I to work out details, but it's another thing for the contractors to come in and say, that's great, but how do I actually build that? I mean, there's always those intricacies that come up, and the sooner we have the construction team on board as well, the sooner we get those issues resolved, and they don't become cost issues, time delay issues towards getting that project done. Because at the end of the day, the owner wants his project ASAP, and we can't afford to delay it.
The owner wants a price tag, and the owner wants a design where he's going to pull the trigger, which we talked about. A lot of times he sits and he waits. So he either winds up with a clean room he never uses, or in my end of the business, we buy equipment that never gets put to use. We call that the boat anchor, which means, same thing. Okay, they're not going to run away, but we got to move on to our next session. Thank you very much, gentlemen.